These are the headlines we're following at this hour. Fears grow over the Israel-Hamas war spilling over into a regional conflict as a U.S. Navy warship in the Red Sea shot down cruise missiles fired by Iran-backed Houthi militants in Yemen that were potentially targeting Israel. Meanwhile, civilians in Gaza are expecting humanitarian aid with the border crossing with Egypt set to open Friday. And amid escalating tensions in the Middle East, South Korean President Yoon Suk-yeol set for his trip to Saudi Arabia and Qatar to bolster economic ties and discuss ways to achieve peace in the region and at home. North Korean leader Kim Jong-un and Russian foreign minister discussed ways to expand bilateral cooperation in a follow-up to the leaders' summit. And amid U.S. accusations over an arms deal, North Korea reaffirms its support for Russia's war in Ukraine. Good afternoon. We start with the latest developments on the Israel-Hamas war, possibly spilling over into a regional conflict. The Pentagon says the U.S. Navy warship intercepted missiles heading from Yemen, potentially toward Israel. Meanwhile, civilians in Gaza are expecting humanitarian aid as early as Friday with the expected opening of the border crossing with Egypt. Lee Soo-jin has the latest.
Fears grow that fighting between Israel and Hamas could escalate into a wider geopolitical conflict. The Pentagon said on Thursday local time that a U.S. Navy ship in the Red Sea shot down 3 land attack cruise missiles as well as several drones that had been launched from Yemen. According to the Pentagon spokesperson, the missiles and drones were fired by Iranian-backed Houthi militants in Yemen, potentially towards targets in Israel.
Information about these engagements is still being processed. We cannot say for certain what these missiles and drones were targeting, but they were launched from Yemen, heading north along the Red Sea, potentially towards targets in Israel.
AFP News reported on Thursday local time that the Rafah border crossing, currently the only route for aid to enter Gaza from outside of Israel, will be opened from the Egyptian side to deliver humanitarian aid on Friday morning. The exact time for the opening, however, has not been specified. More than 150 trucks with food, water, and fuel are waiting at the border crossing. Meanwhile, Israeli Defense Minister Yoav Gallant alluded to a ground assault in the near future. He told troops gathered at the Gaza border on Thursday that while they're looking at Gaza from afar, an order will soon come that will allow them to see the Palestinian enclave from the inside. Fears over civilian deaths continue to mount, with reports on Thursday saying several people who had taken shelter at a church compound in Gaza had been killed or injured in a blast. Since the Hamas militant attack on Israel on October 7, the number of deaths in the conflict has reportedly reached over 5,000. The Palestinian Health Ministry based in Gaza reported that Israel's retaliation to the Hamas attack has left at least 3,785 Palestinians dead in Gaza, of which around a quarter were children. While the UN Office for the Coordination of Human Affairs said the death toll in Israel stood at 1,400 as of Thursday. With this, many nations and international organizations are calling for a ceasefire to prevent the humanitarian crisis from further escalating. Lee Soo-jin, Arirang News.
Meanwhile, U.S. President Joe Biden addressed the nation in a rare primetime speech from the Oval Office. In his speech on Thursday local time, President Biden emphasized the importance of Israel and Ukraine's war successes and stated support for a substantial security package for billions of dollars in military assistance for both countries. He also asked Congress to send Ukraine the weapons to defend itself without interruption. Biden says support for Israel and Ukraine is vital for national security of the U.S., with threats to the U.S. and the world keep rising. He added that the U.S. must make sure that the Israeli government has everything it needs to protect its country, but he also cautioned Israel not to be blinded by rage. Amid escalating tensions in the Middle East, South Korean President Yoon Suk-yeol is set for his trip to Saudi Arabia and Qatar to bolster economic ties and discuss ways to achieve peace in the region and here at home. Our presidential office correspondent Oh Soo-young has a preview.
President Yoon Suk-yeol will seek broader economic ties with Saudi Arabia and Qatar and discuss efforts for regional stability amid the Israeli-Hamas conflict as he becomes the first Korean leader to make an official state visit to Riyadh and Doha. Yoon's office said the President and First Lady Kim Gon-hee will head to Saudi Arabia on Saturday for a 4-day stay. His official schedule begins Sunday with a bilateral summit and luncheon with Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, followed by an investment forum with over 300 Korean and Saudi firms. Yoon will also visit academic institutions to promote further cooperation in the private sector and people-to-people exchanges, and commemorate 50 years of Korea and Saudi cooperation in the construction sector. The South Korean leader will head to Doha on Tuesday and drop by the International Horticultural Exposition before holding bilateral talks on Wednesday with Emir Sheikh Tamim bin Hamad Al Thani. He'll then attend the Korea-Qatar Business Forum before visiting the country's education city. As Yoon's 6-day trip to the Middle East comes amid concerns that the Israeli-Hamas conflict could result in broader clashes in the Gulf region. Yoon's Deputy National Security Advisor said regional security will be high on the agenda during Yoon's summits with the Saudi and Qatari leaders.
Through this trip, we hope to strengthen practical cooperation with Saudi Arabia and Qatar, while also discussing ways to achieve peace in the Middle East and strengthen our own security. The trip is also meaningful in that, as a global pivotal state, South Korea will contribute to discussions on challenges facing the international community.
Also amid concerns of North Korea cooperating with actors like Hamas, Iran and Russia, a senior Yoon official said the president could well raise the issue in this bilateral summit, as Ho seeks greater support in clamping down on Pyongyang's illegal weapons cooperation and evasion of global sanctions. More than anything, the key feature of Yoon's trip will be his economic diplomacy drive, expanding the scope of bilateral business relations from energy and construction to diverse new industries.
38% of our crude oil imports and 21% of our gas imports come from both those countries. As Saudi Arabia and Qatar prepare for the post-oil era, it's time for us to explore new partnerships. More than 70% of the economic delegation will be small and medium-sized companies whose industries are diverse, covering energy and construction, as well as digital, finance, medical and cultural content.
The president will be accompanied by 130 Korean corporate chiefs, including the leaders of Samsung, Hyundai Motor and Hana, to Saudi Arabia, and nearly 60 business leaders to Qatar. This comes as South Korean construction and shipbuilding firms look to procure big contracts in constructing Saudi's Neom megacity and building LNG carriers for Qatar. Beyond business ties, the top office says Seoul will also look to increase cooperation and exchanges in education, culture and tourism as the countries forge future-oriented relations going forward. Oh Soo-young, Arirang News.
South Korea's Defense Minister Shin Won-sik and his U.S. counterpart Lloyd Austin reaffirmed their commitment to the Seoul-Washington alliance and discussed ways to expand the scope of their cooperation. In a phone call on Friday morning, the two emphasized the importance of maintaining a strong combined defense posture to respond to North Korea's nuclear provocations and agreed to communicate frequently on key regional security issues. This was the first phone call between the two defense chiefs since Shin's appointment as defense minister. The two will also meet in person to further discuss ways to expand the scope of their defense cooperation at the upcoming Security Consultative Meeting and the ROK UN Command Member States Defense Ministerial Meeting in November. Russia's foreign minister is in Pyongyang to work on follow-up measures from the summit between the regime's leader Kim Jong-un and Russian President Vladimir Putin last month. The meeting also comes amid U.S. accusations of an arms deal between the two, and North Korea reaffirms its support for Russia's war in Ukraine. North Korean leader Kim Jong-un met with Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov in Pyongyang on Thursday in an effort to deepen bilateral ties amid U.S. accusations of arms deals between the two countries. According to the regime state media on Friday, Kim Jong-un used the talks to establish a long-term plan for the new era of stable and future-oriented relations. This comes roughly a month after Kim Jong-un traveled to Russia for a rare summit with President Vladimir Putin, with the two sides seemingly speeding up the implementation of follow-up measures to that meeting. Some details were mentioned during Lavrov's meeting with North Korea's Foreign Minister Choi Son-hee on Wednesday. They include ramping up trade and economic cooperation, resuming political dialogue with full-scale contacts, and possibly laying out foundations for Putin's reciprocal visit to Pyongyang. Also on the agenda was shared concern over, quote, increasing military activity on the Korean peninsula by South Korea, the U.S. and Japan, as well as Washington's deployment of strategic assets in South Korea. And North Korea's support for Russia's war in Ukraine, which Moscow claims is an effort to repel Western aggression, was also discussed. This comes just days after the White House accused North Korea of shipping arms to Russia, citing American intelligence tracking 1,000 containers of what was described as military equipment and munitions. The U.S. State Department once again reaffirmed their stance, vowing all possible measures to hold Russia and North Korea accountable for the arms deal, which will be a violation of UN Security Council resolutions. Over in the U.S., Federal Reserve Chairman Jerome Powell says inflation in the U.S. is still too high and said lower economic growth is likely needed to bring it down. Powell also noted that geopolitical tensions pose a threat to the global economy. Lee Seung-jae has more.
Speaking at the Economic Club of New York on Thursday, U.S. Federal Reserve Chairman Jerome Powell said inflation in the U.S. is still too high, and in order to bring it down to the central bank's target of 2%, it will likely require a slower growing economy and job market. Powell says although inflation has cooled significantly compared to a year ago, the economy is growing faster than the Fed had expected and could continue to keep inflation high. According to the U.S. Fed chair, in order to reach the target inflation of 2%, it will likely require a period of below-trend growth and some further softening in labor market conditions. Still, Powell refrained from commenting on the central bank pushing for higher interest rates to further ease inflation, instead saying that he and the policymakers will continue to analyze data to make their decisions.
Given the uncertainties and risks, and given how far we've come, the committee is proceeding carefully. We will make decisions about the extent of additional policy firming and how long policy will remain restrictive based on the totality of the incoming data, the evolving outlook, and the balance of risks.
Meanwhile, amid the prolonged war in Ukraine and ongoing armed conflict between Israel and Hamas, Powell says geopolitical tensions pose risks to global economic activity, adding that economic implications remain highly uncertain. Powell also called the attack on Israel and the prospect of more lives lost horrifying. Lee Seung-jae, Arirang News.
And following remarks by U.S. Fed Chairman Jerome Powell raising expectations of continued high interest rates, U.S. Treasury yields have hit their highest since 2007. On Thursday, local time, Reuters reported that the benchmark 10-year Treasury yield surpassed the 5% mark for the first time in 16 years. All three major U.S. stocks slid as risk-averse investors seek safe haven assets, with the S&P 500 tumbling by 7%. The European Union is gearing up to implement a new climate measure called the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, aimed at preventing carbon leakage by ensuring a fair carbon pricing for imports. That could impact many South Korean companies once it goes into effect. Our Moon Ae-ryun tells us how South Korea is planning to respond.
The transitional period before the full implementation of CBAM for countries exporting goods to the EU, including South Korea, began this month. CBAM is a measure aimed at preventing what's called carbon leakage, when a company moves its production facilities from a country with strict carbon emission policies to one with more lax policies. With CBAM, production facilities based outside of the EU will have to pay the same amount for their carbon emissions as sites within the bloc using the original emissions trading system. From the beginning of this month up until the end of 2025, only greenhouse gas emissions need to be reported without needing to make any financial payments. But from 2026, importers will need to declare the quantity of goods being brought into the EU in the preceding year, as well as what's called their embedded greenhouse gas emissions, which are greenhouse gas emissions generated during the production and transportation of goods. They will then have to surrender the relevant number of CBAM certificates priced at the weekly average auction price of EU ETS allowances. The South Korean government estimates that roughly 140 domestic companies will be affected as producers of what the EU defines carbon-intensive goods: cement, iron, steel and aluminium, fertilizers, electricity and hydrogen. Steel and aluminium exports are predicted to drop by more than 1/5 because a survey showed that more than half of South Korean companies who exported goods to the EU and plan to do so in the future do not have any plans in place for CBAM. An industry insider said that the reason behind this is because SMEs don't have the capacity to prepare for new situations like this, and the EU has not yet released detailed guidelines.
Another reason is that there are a lot of companies that lack knowledge or capacity for an organized MRV system.
MRV stands for Measure, Report, Verify, and is a basic tool to report carbon emissions. The government plans to provide funding to SMEs so they can implement it and expand consulting for employees about MRV. In addition to forming a dedicated task force, local companies can use the current domestic emission calculation system to report to the EU until the end of 2025. In an emergency economic meeting earlier this week, Finance Minister Chu Kyung-ho outlined some solutions going forward.
We will consult with the EU to recognise domestic emissions costs. In addition, we will actively support technology development and facility investment to reduce carbon emissions for export items to the EU, such as hydrogen-reduced steel.
The government also plans to open further negotiations with the Taxation and Customs Union of the EU next month. Moon Hae-ryun, Arirang News.
Let's take a look at what's going on in the world now. In India, 41 Canadian diplomats have left the country amid a row over the killing of a Canadian Sikh separatist leader. According to Canada's foreign minister on Thursday, 21 diplomats remain in India. It comes 2 weeks after India asked Canada to withdraw diplomatic staff and threatened that New Delhi would remove the diplomatic immunity of selected envoys if they failed to comply. Canada has called the threat a violation of international law. Tensions between the countries have been high since Canada accused India last month of being involved in the fatal shooting of Hardeep Singh Nijjar in Canada in June this year. It cited credible evidence based on Canadian intelligence. India has denied the allegations and called them absurd. The European Union on Thursday awarded Mahsa Amini its top human rights prize. The 22-year-old died after being detained by Iran's morality police over the country's strict hijab rule for women. Her death triggered nationwide protests that led to hundreds of deaths and many more arrests. Called the Sakharov Prize for Freedom of Thought, the annual prize is given to individuals or groups who have dedicated their lives to the defense of human rights. The prize was also given to the Iranian Women Life Freedom Global Movement, which began after Amini's death. It aims to end Iran's imposition of headscarves on all women and other discriminatory laws. In Spain, around 400 animals have been saved from an international illegal trafficking network. Spanish police on Wednesday said the animals, mostly dogs and cats, were rescued last month as part of a special operation. 13 suspects were arrested. The operation goes as far back as 2020, when authorities received complaints of unsanitary conditions at a pet shop in Barcelona. Their investigation found suspicious paperwork that helped to uncover the illegal ring. It was active across Barcelona, Madrid, Andorra, and Eastern Europe. The police operation comes a month after Spain brought in a new animal welfare law that bans the buying of certain pets in stores or online. The suspects face several charges, including animal abuse, fraud, and document forgery. And finally, police in the Polish capital of Warsaw have arrested a man accused of pretending to be a display mannequin in order to commit burglary. Footage of the 22-year-old man shows him standing still and holding a bag in a store window until closing time. He then allegedly tried to steal jewelry before being spotted by security guards. He has also been accused of burglary at 2 other malls. In one case, he allegedly had a meal at a restaurant around closing time and then entered a store to steal clothes. In the other case, he waited until after closing time at another store and took money from several cash registers. The man faces a potential sentence of up to 10 years in prison. Matthew Ashley, Arirang News.
Good afternoon. The fine autumn season is in full swing in Korea. There are many places you can go for autumn trips to enjoy nature's beauty. And remember, the end of October to early November is peak autumn color season here in Korea. About today's weather, rain in certain parts of the country has let up and sunshine has returned. But that rain has brought chillier air to the country. Highs should be 3 to 7 degrees, lower than yesterday afternoon. Seoul only getting up to about 14 degrees Celsius. Most places, in fact, staying in the teens all day. Daegu and Gwangju see highs of 17 degrees Celsius. But, it's a pleasant day for outdoor activities under bright skies with decent air quality. And many will hit the road for leaf peeping this weekend. Thankfully, skies will remain sunny, but there will be a huge drop in morning temperatures. Seoul will wake up to just 5 degrees Celsius on Saturday, Chuncheon at 2 degrees. Don't forget to pack extra layers. That's Korea for you, and here's a look at the international weather conditions.
There was a briefcase that caught people's attention during Russian President Vladimir Putin's visit to China. Some rare video footage was released by Russian media where Putin is walking surrounded by security and naval officers. And the camera zooms in on the nuclear briefcase, also known as Chiget, that can be used to order a nuclear strike, similar to the nuclear football used by U.S. presidents. Putin's nuclear briefcase remains with him at all times, but it is rarely filmed, which is why some observers see the display as an intentional reminder from Putin that the nuclear card remains on the table amid the war in Ukraine, especially as it comes just when Russia's parliament revoked the ratification of a nuclear test ban treaty. This is where we end today's newscast. Thanks for watching.